Now, I assume you all know who John Lee Hooker is. He's still going strong. John Lee Hooker invented this kind of guitar playing. He called it boogie guitar. Now, one day, like I was saying, I was over at John's house. We were talking about the origin of the blues one day. And John came up with a kind of an interesting theory. He said that he didn't think the blues necessarily came from any particular place or any individual person or persons. In fact, it sounded to me like he was saying that the blues came from our mothers. And I asked John, I said, well, that's a different theory. I said, could you elaborate on that for me a little bit? And he did, and he told me this story. And it went like this. He said, I was born in Clarksdale, Mississippi. And my mother was a church person. Now, my mama, she wanted me to stay in the house, in my bedroom, and read that Bible all night long. She said, John Lee, she said, nothing good is going to come of your life unless you do exactly what I say. But he said, I had that little boy devil in me, and I would sneak out of my mama's house, and I would go down to downtown Clarksdale to hear an old man named Will Moore play the guitar. And at that point of the conversation, I said, John, she said, I never heard of this guy, Will Moore. And he said, that's right. He never made any records. And I said, what did he play like? And he said, he played that old country guitar. And I said, what kind of country guitar are you talking about? And John Lee picked up his guitar, sitting on the living room couch, and he put it on his lap, and he played a bit like this. But I play like this. I said, I know what you mean. He said, yeah, I'd go down all the time and hear old man Will Moore play that guitar. But you know, he said, Amos, every so often, every night, in fact, I'd have to sneak back in my room. And my mama, she'd always be there, and she'd always catch me. And she'd say, thunder and damnation, John Lee Hooker, she'd say. She said, you know what I told you about nothing good coming from your life unless you stay in that room and read that Bible all night long. She'd say that every night, and finally, I just had to say something to her. And this is what I said. I don't care. I don't care. Don't allow, I'm gonna boogie anyhow, anyhow. We boogie the way like this, get it running. I said, at that point in time, I said, John Lee Hooker, I said, I think that theory might hold water. Now, I was born in Willowdale, Ontario, the home of the blues. But my mama was not a church person, but she was a book person, and she said to me when I was a little boy, Amos, you gotta stay in your room and read those books all night long. You gotta learn about that history and that permutations and calculations, biology, Canadian history. And I had that little boy devil in me too, though, and back in the time, it was a particularly good time in downtown Toronto to be listening to music. And I used to sneak out of my mama's house too, and I'd go over to the Yonge Street subway, and I would head on downtown to do what I call my Yonge Street crawl, and went like this. First place I would stop, I'd get off at Wellesley. And I would go to an old club that was upstairs where you couldn't drink unless you brought your own booze in a bag. It was called the Blue Note. Anybody here ever was in the old Blue Note? You're aging, man. They had a band there called Diane Brooks and the Silhouettes. Man, she could sing, probably still can. And a tenor saxophone player named Steve Kennedy. Haven't heard from him in some time. Smitty on the organ. And I'd listen to them, I'd be very happy. I could go home just listening to that one band, but One said I would head on out down to around Gerrard Street. Yes, to a little place called the Zanzibar. You ever go to the Zanzibar, lady? The Zans. They had a little band there called David Clayton Thomas and the Shades. Yeah, left-handed guitar player named Freddie Keeler. I don't know what happened to him. I hope he's all right. Yeah, and I listened to those guys, man, they could play. Pretty soon I'd say, let's just go down a little further, down around Dundas Street. And I'd drop into what we used to call the hip trip on the Yonge Street Strip. It was called the Cock Door, the Golden Rooster. And almost a house band in that place was a little band called Levon Helm and the Hawks. Back when they were playing blues and R&B and that stuff. Man, I think they were my favorite band back then. They had a good guitar player in that band too. I don't know whatever happened to him. And then maybe I'd head on down to the Friars Tavern right down there around Queen Street. They had all kinds of bands there, always named somebody and the somebody or others, like Dickie Doo and the Don'ts, Robin Lee and the Disciples, Robbie Lane and the Disciples. Yeah, good bands. But sooner or later, all good things had to come to an end, and I would have to go back and sneak in my mama's house. And sure enough, she'd catch me trying to sneak in the house, and she'd say, Amos, I know where you've been. You've been down on Yonge Street. You know nothing good is going to come of this. Now tell me something. Now, have you learned anything lately about history? And I'd say, I don't know much about history. She'd say, well, how's your biology coming along? I'd say, I don't know much about biology. And then my mom would say to me, well, what do you know? I'd say, well, I know that I love the blues, Mama. She'd say it a little louder. I'd say, I love the blues. My mama said, well, you foolish little thing. Don't you know? I love the blues too. Then I said, Mama, I guess it's okay for me to say this back to you. And I said, I don't care. Boogie, children. Well, we thank you for that reminiscent little rundown, Main Street.